Welcome to Powering Through Life, the podcast. I'm your host, Teresa Sims. I'm a coach, an author, wife, mom, survivor, and thriver. Each week on Powering Through Life, my guest and I will discuss a special topic that's close to their heart. Together, we will explore the challenges they have faced in life and learn what strategies and tools they have used to power through their life. So get ready to be inspired, motivated, and become a thriver. Hello and welcome to Powering Through Life. Oh my goodness, I have the most amazing guest today. You're just going to really resonate with this young man and his story. So today my guest is Davidson Hang. And Davidson has been helping, he has a humble beginning of helping high achievers love themselves more through self-development courses. Davidson's been working in tech sales for companies such as LinkedIn Learning, Udemy, Fortune Magazine, and Coaching Hub. Davidson, that's quite an extensive and impressive background. First of all, welcome to Powering Through Life.
Thank you, Teresa. I love the intentionality and the fact that you're bringing it back. I know that podcasting can be anyone who's a podcaster knows the amount of time and effort and just planning and preparing and just all the work that goes into making this. And it's a weird thing because podcasting, you don't get as much feedback, right? Because so much of it is just you see the numbers like, oh, 150, 150 downloads, per episode, whatever. But then sometimes it's like, oh, like these are actual human beings that are listening. But it is a weird feedback loop in terms of just how the platform is structured.
Absolutely. And my motive and my mantra, I guess, is to motivate the world through conversation. And that's what I love doing, is just having conversations around your topic. And this is such an important topic, a powerful topic, and we all need to take a listen and a look at this. And Davidson's topic today is loving yourself. Powerful stuff. Davidson, can you give us some background behind you and tell us why loving yourself is so important?
Hmm. I think many high achievers struggle with this, right? Because we get validation when we win Employee of the Month or we win all these awards. And, I've been very fortunate enough to work at world-class organizations, like you mentioned, at like Fortune Magazine and at LinkedIn, which I was competing against 138 other candidates that I ended up, getting the job over. And, life rewards you, especially, so I live about an hour from New York City. I was in New York City yesterday. And, when you're surrounded by a lot of these like ultra high achieving folks that have gone to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or whatever, right? It's hard for you to be kind with yourself because, at least in my case, when I was working at LinkedIn, it felt like everyone was like a national debate champion or had like 8 black belts. And I realized that so much of my life has been like people pleasing, like really my winning formula was being a chameleon. So I was able to shift and be able to adapt, but I didn't love myself in the sense that I was always comparing myself to other people. And instead of honoring like my process and where I've been and how far I've gone, I was like, oh, well, my friends have like 3 kids now, and like I'm 30, I'm turning 37 this month, and like I don't even have kids yet, right? So it was a gradual process, but I realized like, wow, like I have a long way to go in terms of like self-acceptance and just honoring where I am at the moment and not wanting things to be different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand, like, comparing yourself constantly to other people, all it does is just destroy your self-confidence, your self-esteem, and everything that you pretty well believe in. And it can really have detrimental effects to our mental health, how we show up every day, and the work that we do, and our relationships as well.
Yeah, I think so many of us, like people that have recovering people pleasing tendencies, like we think so much about relationships with others, but and it sounds corny to say this, but it's like, oh, well, it's so cliche, right? It's like the only relationship that truly matters at the end of the day is like the relationship with ourselves. But when I distract myself by calling everyone all the time, making sure they're okay, like being that person for everyone else. Sometimes I neglect my own needs and my own, whether it's just honoring, like, hey, like it's okay to watch. Like now I'm finally watching TV, and it's like, wow, I haven't really truly been able to like watch TV peacefully for 10 years because I was like, oh, like this is a bad thing. Like I shouldn't. I should be writing a book on like it's like there's sh so many shooting on myself, and that took me a while to honor myself, and it's okay to be a human being at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And very true and really profound statements. What brought you to the point? Like, what is your background that brought you into this space of self unacceptance? I guess is a good way to phrase it.
I like that. That's really yeah. I like how you phrase that. I've never heard that said before. Um, I think for me, it was just like I was taking inventory because I think sometimes like a lot of us New Yorkers, like this, especially when I was living in New York City, I didn't realize it because I was just on the hamster wheel, right? It's like, oh, going to all these cool events where I'm surrounded by millionaires, like hedge fund folks, partners of law firms and accounting firms. And I didn't realize this, but it came to the point where my wife was like waiting for me to come home to eat dinner with, and she would be like, starving herself because she's like, oh, like I just want to be able to enjoy dinner with you, right? Like that's what a happy family does. And I would be like, yeah, yeah, I'm almost done my event. So I would leave the house at like 6 a.m., go into the Empire State Building where I worked, and I would come home at like 8:30, 9 o'clock every night. And my poor wife, like, she's such a saint for having to have the patience to, still have faith that, I'm truly committed to the marriage. But I think it came to a point where I was like not getting that much sleep. Every time I met someone, they would be like, "Wow, you have a lot more gray hair than before," and it was just to a point where I just didn't even know who I was anymore because I was a chameleon. Like whoever I was when I was hanging out with people of color, I'd be like my language would change. When I was hanging out in corporate, I'd be like very proper, and was hanging out with my friends from back home, I would speak a different way, and it just became to a point where it's like, who am I? That's like unfiltered from societal, from cultural expectations of being a Vietnamese American. And I just had to do some thinking but it didn't I didn't think about it until it reached like a critical point where I was like, why do I feel like I have so much anxiety? Like why do I feel like so restless all the time? So that's what prompted me to have a more deeper dive into who I am and why I was feeling that way.
Yeah, that's incredible. I know when we had our talk earlier, you had mentioned that, you felt responsibility to yourself a little bit, but more to everyone else, to your family, to your heritage, to the new country your family came to. Like that must have been a real upheaval for you to try to find your way to navigate all of that stuff. How did you do
Mm.
it?
Yeah. I mean, I want to honor like and recognize that like I am privileged that like I live in America, right? And I was born near Philadelphia, like I was close enough to New York City. So I also want to acknowledge that like we all have our own struggles, right? So I don't want to because what I hate is being a victim and being like, hey, it's all about me and so I just want to acknowledge that I'm also like I'm a male, right? So that comes with its own privileges of certain things that I take for granted. So I want to start off by acknowledging that.
Thank you. Yeah,
Um,
perfect.
I It's interesting because I think a lot of Asian Americans like struggle with or any immigrants that comes to the US, right? And we all have at some point, whether it's your ancestors, your grandparents, your parents, right? So I also want to acknowledge that as well because America was at one point like the natives, right? The Cherokees, the Shawnees, like the Lenapes, like all these folks. So I also want to acknowledge that as well. So it's an interesting dynamic where you come in and my parents have their history of the war, and my mom's place was bombed like during the war. So she, with all of that in mind, like I came, like when I was born, she'd always be like, "Oh, like you're so lucky. Like you have no idea like what it's like, like you actually have freedom. Like you actually have all these like pleasure, like you're able to go on a field trip and like go to Disney and stuff like that I'm paying for you." So I just felt like I had a responsibility to like it's like, "Oh, I need to buy my mom a house." And like that's like the mark of like being a good son. So she would remind me like every pretty often, like at least once a month, like, "Hey, like you're doing this because like you're able to like take care of the family one day and and be able to buy me a house one day." So I just had all this pressure.
Yeah.
And then when I would be working and my mom would be like, "Why you look so stressed? Like what's going on?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, my job is like cold calling and getting hung up on and like losing like deals like left and right and just a lot of pressure I was like putting on myself." And my mom's like, "Hey, like stop working so hard." I'm like, "I'm doing this for you, mom."
Yeah.
So it was a lot of pressure, but then I realized like, oh, why am I like blaming her? Like part of it is like I'm choosing to work a lot and go to 1,000 networking events. So that was what prompted me to realize like, oh wow, like I'm putting like a unhealthy amount of pressure on myself.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, like for myself too, those cultural differences can add a lot of unnecessary pressure. We kind of, through generations, take on the pressures of our previous ancestors. And I sometimes I don't understand why we do that, other than it's the way we're raised. And it's not our stuff. We have to recognize it's their story. We have our own story. And did you ever, when did you decide that you didn't love yourself enough? How did you
Hmm.
figure that out and come to that point?
Hmm. Uh, Yeah, I would say like the three pivotal moments was I think I made a story that when my dad left us when I was a sophomore in high school. So I made a story that, oh, I wasn't good enough for my own father to stick around. So I had an expectation of like, oh, like parents are supposed to be there for their kids, like are supposed to be like if not physically there, like emotionally there for their kids, right? That's like the assumption I made based on comparing myself to others and a lot of my friends that had amazing parents, and this is just from my perspective, right? And so that was the first mark of like when I was like, oh, I guess I'm not good enough. And then there were a lot of moments in school where I like have almost failed out of college, or I just didn't do well in school, or I got picked on by my being the class clown, like trying to get attention. I didn't realize this, but I was just seeking like validation and approval. And the method I did was like, oh, let me act up in class because it then people are paying attention to me. So I think that was just the second one where it's like, okay, almost failed out of college, like did not get good grades or um, I wasn't being like a good Asian, which, when people like copied off of me for during the math tests and quizzes, like they would fail. And it's like because they just assumed I was good at math. So all these like little things. And then I would say like the biggest common theme that amongst all of this where I felt like I wasn't good enough or where I wasn't being kind with myself was like during being laid off from four different companies. Like have certain that was like evidence or like, oh, like I just must be like a crappy employee or crappy person. So that really all a combination of those things led me to having very low self-worth and self-esteem, low self-esteem.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like that would be one blow after another, just knocking you back down. But how did you love yourself when you feel like you keep making bad decisions? Like if you were making decisions and they weren't
Hmm.
working for you, how did you find the love for yourself in that?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think initially, like any young person, it's like I found it through like getting validated from my friends and other people. So if I'm feeling like I have low self-esteem, I would ask my wife now, but my girlfriend at the time, I'd be like, "Hey babe, like, what do you love about me?" So it was very much seeking validation from others. So do a lot of these self-development communities. I must have asked like 165 people over the course of 10 years, like wasn't like in one week, but just like, hey, like what are my strengths and weaknesses? Like what do you like why are we friends? And then or if I'm having a bad day, I would call my friends and then they would lift me up. They'd be like, "Oh my God, like you're super brilliant and you're just so thoughtful and you've written like, 300 handwritten cards like and like, you're just like an amazing human being." So every time I would get that validation, I'd be like, "Oh yeah, like okay." And it would remind me. So some of it, I'm not gonna lie, was just like do like community and just like asking my community what do they see in me or what are my superpowers? But then I realized like, okay, even that is still like very externally driven, right? So I think for me, when I started loving myself was when I like meditated and I would do like transcendental meditation or I would go to and I would just have space to just be in nature. And then I would just feel very connected. I'd be like, oh wow. And it would just give me space to just be like, good job, Davidson. Like, you published 4 books and you're still relatively young. You have another one on the way. And it just gave me time to just appreciate and just have gratitude for things.
Absolutely. And there was one question when you were talking about getting validation from friends and colleagues and associates. Did you actually believe what they were saying? Did you feel it? Or was it just, yeah,
Hmm.
okay, and fluff it aside? Which a lot of us
That's
do.
that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's like I would deflect and I'd be like, no, you're amazing, or like, oh, that's probably what you see within yourselves. Like if someone's like, oh, Davidson, you're brilliant, like, you're winning all these awards, or you won the Relationship Matters Award at LinkedIn, like, yeah, clearly like you're a good person, right? Or else you wouldn't have won that. And then I would always deflect and be like, oh, they probably just thinking that's probably how they think of themselves. This has less to do with me and more with them. So I would be like, no, you're the brilliant one. Like you did all the work, like if we did projects together, it's like, oh, like it was your idea, or like you introduced me to the men's group, which is why how I published Redefining Masculinity, right? So it was really hard to be with that data point, like that feedback. So my first initial was to reflect. But then after a while, like, because when you ask like 160 something people, like that's like an overwhelming amount of data points, right? So I think it's funny because like it was after maybe like when I've done like 100 podcast episodes and I was like, oh, like maybe like there's something here. But it's funny because I didn't realize it until like the 107th podcast episode. Then I'm like, huh, like there might be something here, but even that is like still hard for me to be with. Like I would have to be like overly like almost like overly humble or like show like a lot of humility in those instances.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Davidson, what were the triggers and the negative thoughts that hit you, and how did you overcome them? What did you use besides meditation, transcendental meditation, grounding yourself? Like,
Mm,
give us some ideas of what those triggers were, what the negative thoughts were that were besides I'm not good enough and I don't love myself enough,
mm.
like the deep meaning behind.
Yeah, I mean, you've done, you do timeline therapy. EMDR has helped a lot because I was able to like essentially relive a lot of those traumatic moments. So it's like me going back to when I failed, I re had to redo second grade and going back to like when my mom scolded me for losing the uniform. So I had to like relive a lot of these moments. So all the racist comments people have said about my lack of masculinity or when I got beat up, stuff like that. Like I really had to like relive all of these moments. So there's like 12 moments in my life that like have created my false identity of feeling like not enough. So I literally had to like relive them and cry. And this is through a combination of acceptance, CBD, like so cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, which is similar to hypnosis, um, and then Landmark was helpful in figuring out like what is my winning formula, which is like based on those 3 moments in my life. So one during childhood, one during teenager, one during adult, which I mentioned getting let go, failing out of second grade, and when I was like when I was hit, physically hit from my father. So those after like reliving those moments, I was like, oh, that's why I'm afraid of conflict, or oh, that's why I feel like I have to mediate everything and I have to make sure. So those moments have been very, very formative and me having real the self-awareness around like why I'm avoiding conflict and why I have low self-esteem.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I know with timeline therapy and NLP and CBT, you visit the events. You don't
Mm,
necessarily relive them, but you visit them. You take with timeline therapy, you remove the emotional attachment out of the event, but you also
mm,
take the learnings. And the learnings are what are key to being able to progress in life and to put those events that caused us harm in the past where they belong, where
mm.
they don't attach themselves emotionally to us anymore, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, like what you said, yeah, maybe reliving isn't so with EMDR, because I haven't done timeline therapy yet, but I do think NLP with Tony Robbins, some of his frameworks, it's helpful in terms of like pinpointing what was the meaning I made out of that moment. So like let's say being let go 4 times, right? Instead of me kind of like crying and kind of like being stuck in the past, like, oh yeah, it's like, okay, what was the lesson that I learned? It's like, oh, when I got let go from Rutgers DNA lab, it was because I skipped classes to work because I was like addicted to money and I was afraid of because I was like, oh, like they wouldn't believe me if I told them the truth, which is like I skipped class because they looked at the schedule and saw like, how can he be working? How can he be in class? But the lesson there was like, oh, I was afraid of conflict and I wasn't able to like defend myself. Like I wasn't able to speak for myself because I was like, oh, management knows best and they wouldn't believe me anyways, right? So I wasn't able to set my foot down and be able to defend myself, right? So the lesson there was like, okay, like avoiding conflict resolution is something that I've been avoiding. It's like, okay, that was the takeaway from that.
Yeah. So when you dug your heels into conflict resolution for self improvement, how did that transform your life?
Mm. I mean, it's something I still struggle with, conflict resolution, like specific to the marriage, right? Because I want to make my wife happy and I want to spoil her and give her the best life possible. So part of it is just like my winning formula has got me to where I am now, which is a lot of, 19,000 LinkedIn friends and like a lot of people I can call, right? But what was missing was, oh, I was avoiding like asking for a raise, and that's why I would leave jobs to get, $15,000 additional base increase at competitors and stuff like that. It's like, oh, I wasn't able to speak, like communicate my needs and what I needed from my manager, so I would seek a different manager who would give those skills, right? But it's so how can I take 100% responsibility instead of being a victim of, oh, well, this my manager like doesn't care about me or oh my manager is like so focused on supporting these other employees. It's like, well, if I never communicated that, then like how would they be able to support me? So it's like I once I realized that I was like, oh, this is showing up everywhere in life, in my marriage, with my mom, with sisters, my dad, like, oh my God, it's everywhere.
Oh my goodness. So recognizing those negative thoughts and those limiting beliefs that you had and recognizing that you were almost running to escape, it seems like.
Hmm.
Would you agree with that statement or?
Yeah, yeah, it's I didn't have a father, so let me run to these executives and unfairly put them on a pedestal and also like relate to them as like my father, my pseudo father figure, which has led me to interview a lot of mentors and there's good that has come from that, right? It's like, oh wow, I was creating this podcast because I created this thing called Breaking Through the Bamboo Ceiling where I interviewed like 32 Asian executives in the C-suite, VP, senior directors, and above. So some good came from that, but it's like, oh, okay. Am I doing it from a place of fixing? Like I need to fix myself or I need to fix like the problems in our society? Or am I just generally like, no, like I want to create value for the world and create a repository of resources for folks who also haven't had a father in their lives. It's like the result is the same, but one is like exhausting and one feels like it's like, oh, I have to do this or else like I'm a failure. And one is more like, oh, this is just like an expression of who I am and who I'm being in the world.
Yeah. Oh, that's incredible and great insights on that and recognizing that, when there's an aspect of your life missing, you'll find some way to replace it or find someone to
Mm,
replace it. And I totally
mm,
understand the pedestal thing. I've recently had that happen to myself, and it's overwhelming. It's unfair to do that to the individual because they have no idea that
mm,
it's almost like you're idolizing them. You want to be
mm,
them. You
mm,
want everything they have, but there's a gap somewhere
mm.
in our own selves. And um, so when you feel like your friends are not and people are not no longer reaching out to you, Davidson,
Mm.
how do you stay in touch with your community by making more meaningful connections, I guess?
Mm. This is a good one because I have a tendency to overshare, as my old manager would say, and she was very much separation of church and state, where work is work, personal is personal. Like, growing up in a very lack of boundaries place, living in the living room, sleeping in the living room with my two sisters, like on a bunk bed where I was on the top bunk. So there was literally like physically a lack of boundaries, and like, we were all living in the living room. So th I didn't realize that my lack of boundaries is also sometimes my greatest asset, where like I'm able to be very vulnerable and just share like a lot of the stuff we're talking about now. Like, it's safe to say that the majority of the world probably wouldn't speak in a public setting, like some of the things I talked about. But then it can be very uncomfortable for people who, because sometimes people do need to warm up. And, if I'm just like, the first thing I ask them is like, what are your deepest, darkest secrets? Like, people are gonna be like, whoa, like, like you just skipped a few steps here, right? So to answer your question, I would say it's like reading the room. It's like, okay, we're the container that we're in is like, it's like very vulnerable. Like, everyone's talking about like intergenerational trauma. It's like, okay, this is a safe space where I could lead with that. But if it's like in a work setting that's like, maybe I'm like surrounded by lawyers, and we all know lawyers, like their job is to literally mitigate risk, right? So, if I'm leading with that at a law event, then like that's just me being foolish, and that's just gonna rub people the wrong way, or they'll just think it's weird. Versus like if I'm in like a meditation group and we're at a retreat where everyone's like talking about their identity and some of the challenges that they have, attachments, and it's like, okay, like that's probably a safe space where I can talk about my attachment to success, or my attachment to finding idols and mentors, and being like addicted to that journey, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real challenge to and I guess this is the chameleon aspect, is to know your audience, know where you're walking into,
Mm,
know where you're going to be. And is it the right aspect to go in and try to be something you're not, try to fit in? Or is it more appropriate to be genuine and honest and who you truly
mm,
are? I mean, I realize there's a business persona and there's a personal persona and all that sort of thing, but how taxing physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually is it to
mm,
go for you to go into a space that's high profile when you feel like you can't be yourself? You have to be that other persona.
hmm. I think choice is what I'm hearing here. It's like, okay, let's say my intention is, let me lead with curiosity. If I'm hanging out with like hedge fund managers, right? I think in the past I would be so insecure. I'd be like, oh my God, they all graduated from like Harvard Business School. They all know each other. Like, I'm like the youngest person here. Then it's like, if it's about me, then it's like, then I'm just gonna be stressed. I'm gonna be like worried. I'm like, oh my God, my suit was only $200, where like they have such nice like suits. So I think if I'm grounded in, like the value I could add to this specific situation is like, let me bring energy and like exuberance and joyfulness, and like almost like a naiveness that is cute, that is like, oh, like they invite that energy, and then it's like, okay, then I can just come in and just be myself. But if it's like, oh God, okay, like, oh, I need to add value. If I don't add value, then like I might not ever speak with these people ever again. Then there's almost like a neediness. There's almost like a I'm like putting them on a pedestal, like we talked about earlier. And to your point, yeah, like it is very exhausting. Like it's super tiring. But I do think it's like having choices. Like yes, maybe a certain percentage of it, it's like I still want to adapt and be able to at least yeah, but I think it's at what expense? Like, am I being someone that's completely different where I'm exhausted by the end of the day? It's like, well, that's not healthy. So there's like a delicate balance because I think sometimes being too upfront and honest can be off-putting for some people, right? Where like, let's say like I've never met this person, I'm giving them feedback like, hey, by the way, like you should probably uh use less filler words and I've never met this person before, they're gonna be like, what the freak? Like, what gives you the right to give me that feedback, right? So I think it just depends on, but it's like ultimately having choice. Like, okay, today am I gonna let's make it a game. Like today I'm gonna like be curious and like let's see if I can bond with women and truly understand what are the challenges that women that they experience moving up to executive leadership, and that's my intention, then I could be more of a chameleon in the sense that like I could talk about how I live in a house with two sisters and my grandma and my mom, and like that could help us as a baseline. It's like, okay, this guy, instead of being like macho, like toxic masculinity and being like, oh, like, what are you doing here? It's interesting, but that's what I have found to be a good like in between balance.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you're going into these other areas, these higher profile meetings or connections, sometimes they need to be shaken up. Sometimes a new, fresh aspect or energy, maybe that's what they need. Maybe that's what they're looking for, but they're too stuck in their own ways to recognize that it could actually benefit them in the long run as well. You
Hmm.
never know, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's I mean the good news is it does feel like the world is being more open to like vulnerability, but there's still a long way to go. But I work for some tech companies where I was catching up with a former colleague of mine at Coach Hub. She works at a company called Culture Amp now. And for the background, and every employee has their own custom background, but she wrote openly about and then it said the prompt was ask me about, and then it showed just some of her interests. And one was talking about like the LGBTQ community, which like that's like, not many people would lead with that, but that was her background. And I just thought that was so cool. I'm like, that's so cool that your company, you feel safe enough that that could be one of your five main topics to ask me about when you're meeting with clients that you've never met with before. Like that would have never happened like 20 years ago to be able to make it that open. So I have hope and I see that there's change, but that's not the norm. We still have a long way. To your point, I think everyone thinks there should be like a business persona and a personal persona. But I find that the folks that can truly integrate and just share and just be open and not hide their pain, their vulnerability, those folks are very successful. One of my coaches, his name is Ian Koniak. The reason why I decided to hire him as a coach was because we were at a sales conference, and sales sometimes is like very macho and like, oh, my W-2 was 365K last year. Like, what was yours, right? I mean, they don't say that, but that's the energy and the vibe it is sometimes. This guy, who's the number one salesperson at Salesforce, he would just share about his addiction to porn and strip clubs and like getting drunk because like he felt like his clients, he needed to like entertain his clients. And he was just talking about, hey, like I was a horrible husband and I was very ashamed of it. And once I I shared the truth about and very openly in a conference in front of like hundreds of like top performers. He was so open about it and it was so inspiring. And it made me like really think like, wow, like can I be as open and honest with some of my insecurities? And that's one of the things we're working on now. Like how do I show up authentically and in a way that honors still like the 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 marriage like stuff that my wife probably wouldn't want me to share to like random people, but still honor like how I felt in that moment. And perhaps that can help me grow my business just by sharing some of my takeaways from that.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I mean, we all have things. Everyone on this earth has something that they've gone through. whether they share it or not, it's affected them, it's
Mm.
affected who they are, and it's affected how they show up in the world. If I agree with the vulnerability, and I love the work that Brene Brown was doing previous, with the vulnerability and the showing up with your honesty, yourself. And I honestly feel that in a lot of cases, what you're saying is, that gentleman that shared his stuff, that's relationship building. That's him saying, this is who I truly am. Those that need to come to me or be with me or connect with me will.
Mm.
And those that don't, well, maybe it's just not meant to be.
Huh. What you're saying is really profound because I think being a chameleon, what we talked about, we want everyone to accept us and like us. And in that, I wouldn't say there's less substance because that's very like can be somewhat judgmental, but it's Ryan Serhant, he's this like famous like real estate guy. He did a keynote speech at TriNet where in front of I think there was like 900 people at a sales conference once, and he wrote a book. But essentially his takeaway is like with or without you energy. He's like when you exude with or without you energy, it's contagious because this person is so firm in who he or she is in the world that they're going to be unapologetically themselves, and that's refreshing, right? And that's I hate to use the example of Trump winning presidency, right? But that's probably why he became president because for so much of our life we have these like wishy-washy like candidates that are just like they tell you what you want and but behind closed door they're like backstabbing you where Trump it's like no like you get like what you see is what you get and I think it might be a horrible example but like in some ways like I respect that about him. It's like most of society isn't like that.
Well, I hate to use that example as well, but he is take me as I am. And if you don't like it, well, too bad.
Yeah.
That's a little on the extreme side, but at the same time, there's lessons that we can all learn from that. Uh, we are who we are, and
Mm,
we've gone through what we've gone through, and it's helped us to develop into the caring, kind, compassionate human beings that we are. And we can make a difference in this world by sharing our stories and sharing the examples, and by like you say, learning who we are, what we've gone through, experiencing it, exploring it, and then taking a stance of, you know what, this isn't serving me. I'm going to explore this so I can change this. I'm going to explore it so I can grow and grow into who you want to be, what serves you best, and how, because you have to live with what you've done, what decisions you're making. And setting great boundaries is a really
mm,
good first step into
mm,
uh, I don't want to say protecting yourself, but it is a form of protection. Your boundaries
mm,
are who you are, what you stand for, and what you will and will not accept in this world.
mm,
And I think if we can set those boundaries and state them clearly, concisely, with kindness
mm,
and compassion and understanding for the other person's model of the
mm,
world and how they perceive the world,
mm.
then, we can create a lot of change.
Mm. I love what you said about their understanding of the world, right? And too many of us, and some of it is the Western culture, and specifically like in America, for instance, like we're very like self-centric, like we're very like ego is celebrated here, which is great. It leads to like amazing creativity, some of the best artists, some of the most talented folks, right, in terms of just full self-expression. But what's missing is, well, because what was that saying? It's like treat others how you want to be treated.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is like treat others how they would like to be treated, right? And that takes curiosity, that takes like letting go of what we know to be true, which is a lot more difficult than it sounds.
Absolutely. I mean, you have a model of the world. I have a model of the world. They might clash. But if we want to be part of a network, or we want to be part of a group, or we want to be, a relationship, however that may be, I need to understand where you're coming from. I need to understand who you are. just as much as you need to understand who I am and where I come from and what my values and honor system is, like I do yours. If we had that reciprocal relationship going on in this world, I think we could make a huge difference. And a lot of us would be a lot more at peace with ourselves and in our worlds. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and alignment is what I'm hearing as well, right? Because you're taking the time to, like, even prior to this conversation, you took the time to like get to know me and understand, like, hey, what's his story? Like, what's his worldview? Like, what's his perspective? And that helps us be able to be on the same page, and just providing that space. It's clear that like you have gone through your own journey of the hero's journey and the trials and tribulations of life, right? So it's very evident when you meet folks that have gone through the ringer or a tough time, um, and it's like a mutual respect that we have for one another, and it's great because when you have gone through a lot, it's the compassion, the empathy, it goes a long way because like humans, like we are emotional beings. We make decisions based on like emotions, but we back it with logic, right? So there's also that component of, but the first initial, but emotions are still always going to be like a huge part of just interacting with human beings, which in pretty much every profession, you're going to interact with humans eventually.
Yeah, very true. And I agree. I mean, with we all go through something, and that is the reason why I created Powering Through Life, is because there's someone out there that needs to hear these stories. There's someone out there that is looking for something. They're going through a situation that they can't find their way out of. By sharing these stories, that telling someone what you did to get through the chameleon syndrome, almost,
Hmm.
what you did to get out of your own mindset of I have to people please. Somebody out there needs to hear what you did, how you
Hmm.
did it, because if we can inspire that other individual to take one action step today,
Hmm.
then I think we've done something good. And
Yeah.
I think, I love this platform to be able to motivate the world through
Hmm.
conversation. And I love just having conversations with individuals who have gone through stuff,
Hmm.
because we all have. Sharing it helps us release it, helps us to grow, helps someone else in this world
Hmm.
to step out of, or find the courage to step out of, or ask for
Hmm.
help. That's for me what it's all about.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because um like podcasting is interesting, right? Because that's how I started learning about this and how I started being more curious because I would listen to Lewis Howes and Tim Ferriss, like Tim Ferriss specifically around his thoughts around suicide, and Lewis Howes like talking about his struggle with like money, like living on his sister's couch, and Rich Roll, his addiction, his addictive personality, and using marathons and ultra endurance races as a way to cope with his alcohol addiction. And those are the some, and sometimes we think it's, oh, it had these like prominent figures, like these people all have millions and millions of downloads, right? But it could be as simple as like, even if you're just starting off and you just have like 15 views, right? Once we were present to it, it's like, well, those 15 views, like who knows if you were the catalyst that caused them to like finally reach out to a therapist or research on psychology today, what timeline therapy is. So it's sometimes it's hard because we look at the numbers and we forget that these are like actual human beings. At least that's the case with me. But once I'm grounded in that truth, I'm like, oh, like, and then I can acknowledge myself. It's like, wow, Davidson, like you had 40,000 views this month. And instead of me comparing myself to Ian, who has like 140,000 views like per week, right? It's like not empowering when I think of it from a comparison versus just from a genuine like, hey, like this is my mark and leaving a legacy.
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about, is to leave our mark in this world and to create change and help other people grow as we grow and we change and develop into kind, compassionate human beings. Davidson, do you have a favorite quote that you would like to share?
Hmm. So I just wrote a newsletter article today. I wrote, how many of us are guilty of whipping ourselves with a stick every day, saying things to ourselves that we wouldn't speak to any of our friends, right? And I think we all have been guilty of this. Like sometimes like let's say I didn't get the job that I interviewed for, my self-talk and some of it's like so subconscious that I don't even know until I journal and I write it out. And then I would say things like, Daveson, like you didn't prepare enough for the interview, like you bombed it, like maybe you should have got more sleep, or oh, you interrupted that person, like what a failure, you know. I would never say that to any of my like good friends or there's and anyone in general, right? I'd be like, you should be proud. Like with my friends, I would be like, you should be proud of yourself that you got that far, made it to last round of a world-class organization. Like, good for you. Like, I'm proud of you. Like that's like literally the opposite of what I'm telling myself, right? And it's like, man, like how many of us are beating ourselves up? It's got to be a overwhelming majority of people.
I would totally agree. And that negative self-talk, that negative almost self-loathing around we're not good enough, we don't have enough value. Those are all such incredible limiting beliefs. And then we make limiting decisions which affect not only us, but those around
Mm,
us. And it can be really devastating at times. What are Give us two really good tools that you would recommend for someone who has experienced and gone through what you have in your life, like living with, not feeling that you fit in, the chameleon syndrome, all that sort of thing. What are
mm,
two good tools that you would recommend?
mm. Um, I would say reading or listening, whatever, if you're more an audio person, listening to like Ram Dass or Wayne Dyer or like Zig Ziglar, Brian Tracy, like whoever your favorite person, we all have like our go-to like person that we listen to. And like surprisingly, like mindfulness practices have been very helpful. So with Wayne Dyer, he's very much about like being in the present moment and stop thinking so much about the past and just feeling connected and having gratitude for where we are at this point in life. So those folks have been really instrumental in just helping me be able to slow down and take inventory of the the things that are working well in my life versus things that aren't. And I would say journaling has also been a very, very helpful practice. Like specifically, Tony Robbins and he uses a lot of NLP in a lot of his teachings and his lessons. The five questions that he suggests for us to ask ourselves every day is what are you grateful for in life? What are you proud of? Who loves me and who do I love? Um, what what did I do today that impacted another life? Like, and then what what can I improve on today? So what went well and what didn't go well. So that way there's both components, and then that helps us be able to be present to our accomplishments. Because sometimes like we when we reflect, we realize like, wow, it was actually a really productive day. But sometimes it takes some slowing down and like actually putting it out in pencil in a journal for us to come up to that realization.
Yeah, absolutely. And that tactile act of writing something down has a way of releasing what's stuck inside of us as we're writing out those words. It's the pen to paper or pencil to paper. I know a lot of people don't do that anymore, but it is powerful. It's a great idea to actually help you remove those emotions out of you. And I love the journaling aspect. I did it for a long time as well. I'd have my 5 points today that I was grateful for. 5 points that that I could use as resources. 5 points that I, excelled at, what my strengths
Mm,
were that day. And then another coach friend of mine has just started a movement of one word per day to describe how you are. So it could be, in my recent times, it's determined, courageous, inspired. And yes, if I've had an unhappy day, it's like miserable. It's okay to have those days. We all do. And if we say we don't, I think we're kind of fooling ourselves a little bit. So, how can our listeners get in touch with you, Davidson? Because I think that everyone needs to get in touch with this young man and connect with him and just have a conversation, find out more about who he is, how he's rocking the world, and how he inspired himself for change. So, how can we get in touch with you?
I'm pretty active on pretty much all social medias. I would say in order of what where I'm most active is LinkedIn and then YouTube and then Facebook and then Instagram and TikTok. But those are the main channels that I post a lot of content on and a lot of the similar topics as the ones we're speaking about. I also have a website, davidsonhang.com, that will share a little bit more about coaching and if you're a humble high achiever, if you're feeling like you're really hard on yourself and but on the outside you have all the fame, right? Like having a new car, having a new house or working at a world-class company like LinkedIn or Microsoft, etc. But you're feeling like, huh, I wonder why I feel still a little bit empty or why I'm being really hard on myself. Those are typically the folks that I support
That's
in a
fantastic.
similar journey.
Fantastic. And listeners, please do get in touch with Davidson. I will include all of his links when we share out the segment. This has been such a profound experience chatting with you, and I honor the time that you've taken with us. Davidson, thank you so much for being an exceptional guest today.
Thanks, Teresa. I also want to acknowledge the space that the intentional space that you've created and you're still actively creating. It's much needed to have like a deeper, longer conversation. I think a lot of podcasts nowadays, it's like, oh, I need to make it 5 minutes or 10 minutes because people don't have the attention span. But it's in these longer, deeper spaces where I find people really enjoy the depth and the um yeah you can go to you're able to see yourself more in when people are like truly sharing versus when people are on a time crunch. So I appreciate
Yeah,
that.
you're very welcome. And listeners, I really want you to connect with Davidson. Davidson, thank you so much for inspiring us today, for motivating us, and for teaching us what it's like for you from a different culture into the American society. I'm Canadian, so it all flows from one country to the next. It's all the same. We all have the same issues. Doesn't matter what country you're in. But I would really encourage everyone to get in touch with Davidson. You've been such a gift to this podcast, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Listeners, get in touch with Davidson, and we will see you again next time on Powering Through Life. Thank you for listening to Powering Through Life, where we explore life's challenges and learn valuable insights from my guests about how they have powered through their lives to survive and thrive. We can learn incredible lessons by sharing and motivating the world through conversation. You can access all of the Powering Through Life episodes on my website, teresasims.com, YouTube, Facebook, and Spreaker. So join us again next time for another inspiring conversation.